and you for tuning in all across the state of Washington on this very, very busy day. Agriculture, of course, is one of our state's most important economic engines. However, a new set of overtime rules could really place farmers and growers in a very precarious position. Workers would be impacted by it as well. Our agriculture director, Pam Lewison, is here to talk a little more about that and what we've seen from the legislature in the past session. Pam?
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone who is tuning in. I'm glad to have you all here. So I wanted to talk specifically about this particular topic because I think it's one that is not probably well explored outside of the ag community, and yet it is one that will eventually affect us all. So in particular, what we're talking about is House Bill 5172 that was passed, Senate Bill 5172 that was passed last legislative session in answer to a lawsuit that was filed in the dairy community in 2019, I believe. I'm going to rely on my guest to give me a few more details and correct me if I'm wrong when we get to her. And what it essentially did was begin the phased-in approach for overtime pay for agricultural workers in our state, which has typically been exempt from overtime pay for a very good reason, which is that agricultural work has some ebbs and flows. We have very busy times of year and less busy times of year. So we're going to get into the weeds a little bit with my guest and good friend, Bre Elsey, who is the owner and operator of B.E. Strategic. And I'll let her introduce herself with a little bit more detail. Thanks for being with us, Bre.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me here today. This is a set of issues that I like to talk about. And like Pam said, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit about it today. My name is Bre Elsey, and I'm the owner of B.E. Strategic, which is a contract lobbying firm. Before then, I spent quite a few years just in labor policy in general, but recently have switched over to the niche, more particularly towards agriculture labor. And as Pam said, a lot of this has to do with the DeRuyter decision that was released in November of 2020 and the ramifications since that decision and what the legislature has done since that time and what the implications are for farmers in the coming years. So I believe we could go into our first slide if you're ready to start.
Yes, Bre, go ahead and share it if you can from your screen.
Let me see if I can. So I think we are going to do a little bit of a switcheroo here, and I'm going to do the sharing.
Okay.
I think you've got to give me access, though.
Stand by. See, this is the fun part about technology is sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So we're in a situation here, and I think Pam, I've just given you access.
All right. There we go.
There we go.
You can tell I was scrolling through this earlier today. So we'll go here and let me expand this screen. How's that look for everybody? Hopefully good.
Looks good.
All right, wonderful. All right, Bre, we're ready.
Okay, so today my goal is to go over a series of questions that I think will help identify the problem and work as we work towards potential solutions. So as you can see, number one, what does agriculture labor look like right now? Two, is this path sustainable? I think a lot of you in the audience probably know the answer to that question. Three, what's causing the problem? And that is where we'll get in kind of a deep dive into some policy issues. And then four, what are the available solutions? I'm not a big fan of being an armchair quarterback. I like to end with goals and things that we can all work on together. I don't find value in sitting on a couch and screaming at the TV. So hopefully at the end, we'll have this goal that we can kind of work on together and see if we can make some repairs to the things that are happening right now. So next slide, please, Pam.
You bet.
So what does agriculture labor look like right now? As you can see, starting on January 1, there has been wage rate increases across the board. The Washington State minimum wage, the adverse effect wage rate, and most notably, as Pam was talking about, the first phase of overtime implementation, which is the result of legislation that passed last year, and that's Senate Bill 5172. Time and a half wages will begin for work hours in excess of 55 hours a week, and that is just phase 1. Phase 2 will be 48 hours a week, and then of course phase 3 will be any work in excess of 40 hours a week. So I did a little breakdown there. You can see where the wage started in 21, how it transitioned to 22, and then also roughly what overtime wages will look like when you start paying time and a half for hours worked over 55 hours a week. So what isn't reflected on this slide are prevailing wages for specific commodities and particular duties, only because that would have been a lot of information for these slides, but it will still be part of our discussion today. So right off the bat, we're looking at 4 different types of wages that are subject to continual increases. So what I find most concerning about these increases is that it doesn't come at a time when the agriculture industry in Washington was particularly healthy or able to weather additional storms. American Farm Bureau Federation created this handy map that you'll see on these slides from the most recent set of census data. And as you can see, Washington was already losing about 2 farms per week before any of these wage increases were announced. As consumers deal with supply chain issues, empty store shelves, I think it's more important than ever for all of us to be a very loud voice in sharing this information about the effects of rapid wage rate increases and the impacts it's had and will continue to have on the statewide agriculture industry. And I found the new census data to be particularly frightening. You know, we obviously see that we're going down a path that is not looking good for Washington agriculture or the state as a whole.
So I think also what's interesting about the census data is that unlike the national census, the US Ag Census is done every 5 years. So if you are a farmer in Washington State, I think ours is somewhere here on my desk, you should have received your new census packet because the next census data collection is this year. So we should have a new data set coming out next year, which will be a really nice tracking point for what is happening in relation to our employee either loss or gain as it relates to the wage increases that we're seeing, but also in what our farm loss or gain looks like. Because I think there's some concern when you look at that rate of attrition of 2 farms a week over the span of a year. That's a really concerning number to me, both as a policy analyst, but also as a farmer, because what is causing that friction that we're dropping farms pretty rapidly in a state that is known for agriculture. And in fact, interestingly, when you look at some of the other data points that Bre brings up on this slide with the adverse effect wage rate in particular, if you look at that 1741 number, that's the new minimum wage for any worker that's on an H-2A visa. However, that minimum wage is not what you would see particularly running as the average minimum wage already in Washington. In fact, when we calculated it last year for purposes of talking about 5172, the average minimum wage for all farm workers statewide was already $17 an hour. So well above both the state's minimum wage and the 1634 for the adverse effect wage rate. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more in some of the next slides as well.
And you're right. I mean, the average wage rate for dairies is closer to $20 an hour. So we were already seeing very high wage rates before any of these increases ever came down the pike this year. All right, I'm ready to go to the next slide. So is this path sustainable? This is our next question. And I should have titled this a little better. It says wage rate forecast. The numbers I used are the AWAR wages, so the adverse effect wage rates. So I created this graph using numbers from the AWAR. It's simply an average of the rate increases from the previous 4 years, and then using that average to forecast the next 4 years. And really, this graph just confirms what all of us already know. There's nothing sustainable about this path. I also never view AWAR increases as just an H2A only problem, but rather an all agriculture problem. Artificially inflated AWAR rates also impact farms that don't utilize the guest worker program. Farms that use a domestic workforce often have to raise their wages to compete with neighboring farms that use H2A workers. And of course, the higher the domestic and AWAR wages climb, the less competitive Washington agriculture becomes with neighboring states and countries. Agriculture is the second largest industry in Washington, right behind aerospace, and any impact on the industry's viability really impacts the state's economy as a whole. And that's another concerning issue that we have to think about as we address these rapidly increasing wage rate issues.
I do think if there's a minor victory in 2022, it's that Washington State no longer pays the highest AWAR in the country. We're now number 2 behind California. But in 2021, when the overtime law was passed, Washington and Oregon actually paid the highest adverse effect wage rate in the country. Interestingly enough, Washington and Oregon have very disparate H2A hiring amounts. Washington is consistently among the top 5 states for hiring H2A workers to the tune of an average of about 25,000 workers a year, as opposed to Oregon, where they hire about 1,500. So it's an apples to oranges comparison when you look at that wage rate in Washington versus Oregon. And I think that artificial driver of the wage rate moving upward, if you look at this trend line in particular, gets really, for lack of a better term, it gets really frightening on farm. You know, when you start looking at, $20 an hour and having to figure out time and a half when you have a profit margin of about 10% to play with your on-farm costs, particularly when you're looking at things like the inflated cost of fuel and all of your equipment and any parts or anything else that you may have to buy to function as a farmer.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point, Pam. And I saw this happen over the last year when the COVID rules came out about bunk beds. So here you had Oregon, who paid the same extremely high AWAR rate that Washington did. But like you said, they had a significantly smaller population of guest workers. So any impact to their bunk bed rules could impact about 1,500-ish people. For us, that bunk bed rule was looking to be catastrophic, right? We had no way to build homes overnight for 25,000 people. So same rule, same wage rates, 2 different states, completely different impacts. One negligible, the second one completely catastrophic. So while Oregon did go on to pass a bunk bed rule, and we didn't really, or in a modified sense, our damages were lessened because of that, but you really couldn't compare it just based on our wage rates and where we were in the H2A spectrum alone in that particular instance.
I also think in that instance, when you're looking at how this all works together with wage rates coupled with COVID mitigation, which is important, but I think you have to look at it in a holistic way because all H-2A workers are promised somewhere to live. So when you change these rules on the fly, what ends up happening is you have the potential for people to show up and be homeless. I don't know if anybody's looked outside lately, but at least at my house, we have unseasonably cold temperatures, and we're forecasted to get 6 inches of snow overnight, which never happens in Moses Lake. So where do you put these folks who have been promised somewhere to live when you can't, as you say, you can't magically make somewhere to live appear out of thin air overnight?
All right, next slide, please. So this is going to be the weediest of all the slides on a policy point here. So the third question, what's causing the problem? So I apologize in advance that this is going to be kind of a dense conversation, but this is the part that if you really appreciate methodology and economics and things like that, you're going to appreciate this. So because there are so many different wage rates, this is really a multifaceted question, but it largely boils down to issues around survey methodology. The survey information that is displayed on the slide is the annual Agriculture Wage and Practice Survey. This survey specifically impacts Washington State prevailing wages for specific commodities and tasks. So as you can see, this is a very expensive survey. As of 2018, the Employment Security Department was paying the University of Washington about $300,000 per year to assist with data procurement. Why they choose University of Washington, I don't know. I would think that WSU or a lot of colleges might even be more equipped for this, but UW is for some reason the person that has the contract. The rest of the funds are dedicated to agency staff for their work on this survey. And last time I checked, that was just one full-time employee. This survey is voluntary. The Federal Department of Labor does not require Washington to perform this survey, nor are the farmers required to disclose their wage data to the University of Washington. So therein lies the problem. Participation for the survey needs to exceed 15% of the survey demographic in order for the survey to be considered statistically valid. ESD struggles to achieve a sampling that meets this threshold set by the Department of Labor, resulting in a survey that is weak and invalid right out of the gates. Additionally, because the survey is voluntary, the results are subject to what's called self-selection bias, meaning that the same subsection of those surveyed respond consistently, which can lead to skewed results. And in this case, that's artificially inflated wage rates. All right, so think, who is more likely to respond to a wage survey? A large farm with dedicated accounting staff, or a smaller mom and pop operation that does all the farming and all the accounting themselves? The smaller farm is going to struggle to participate. Excuse me, which means the survey results will never adequately capture their wage rates or an average of the entire industry. In the end, the average will lean towards the larger farms that oftentimes pay higher wages. This is the bias that occurs from self-selection methodology. If you can choose to participate, one group is always going to be more likely to respond. So I hope that makes sense as far as just what the problem is with the current way we operate surveys today. Most of them are subject to this self-selection bias. So what's the alternative? Stratified random sampling. This is a different approach to the same issue. It divides the industry into smaller groups, which is called strata, and in order to be truly effective, would require a mandatory audit of randomly selected farms. This would likely create a more accurate industry average. However, this idea has never been publicly palatable to farmers or farm worker representatives. No farmer has ever come up to me and said, please, or Bre, please advocate for more mandatory audits of my farm. Never happened once. And I get it. I get why they say that. And the farm worker advocates don't like this idea because the results could be slower annual wage rate growth. So while this idea may resolve some of the issues, it has never grown legs. And it's hard to believe it ever will, as long as farmers and farm workers alike continue to equally, I guess, dislike this methodology. So lastly, another option on the table is the Federal Farm Workforce Modernization Act. So while this bill is focused on modifications to the H-2A program and not the state survey like we were discussing early, the problems that are identified are in the same vein as the state prevailing wage survey. The underlying question is still, how do we address artificially inflated wage rates? Under the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, H-2A wage rates would be frozen for 1 year. Annual wage increases would be capped at 3.25%, and the survey would be modified to become more occupation specific. To provide some context, this year, the AWAR rose by 6.5%. While there is a lot more to this bill, it's interesting to see that both the Republicans and Democrats view artificially inflated wage rates as a problem that's worth addressing together. So as agriculture advocates, we need to keep talking about this issue, keep it before politicians on both the state and the federal level. If survey methodology is really the problem, we have to keep thinking of and working on new solutions to an old problem.
So I think there's a couple of things that come to mind for me immediately, partly because I'm a data nerd. I love the idea of doing the stratified random sampling, partly because I think everyone should have to take a no thank you bite every now and then. And I agree that what it does is sort of gives a better picture of what's happening in a boots on the ground sense, because if you study data for any period of time, everyone has to acknowledge their own biases in any kind of research that you do. We all have it. I have it. I'm always biased in favor of farmers because, it's my other job. But also because, I like food. But I also, I think the Farm Workforce Modernization Act has some really great ideas, and not just on a federal level. I think there's some great stuff that could be applicable on a state level too. I love the idea of a 1 year freeze so that we all have a little bit of breathing room. And that wage increase cap, I think, has the ability to help a lot of people figure out what's what in what they're doing. And I think in particular, I always argue, and I tell people this all the time, if you ask me, I think that farm work is a skilled labor. And so the question I get asked most often about the switch to overtime pay is, well, how come I can't just put everybody on salary? And it comes up all the time. And my response is, you have to be careful, because salary requires a skill level and a certain amount of income for each of your employees if you put them on a salary. Now, if you ask me, not everyone, you can't take somebody off the street and say, fix my tractor, or pick those apples for color, or, I need you to go out, sit on my telehandler and load up that truck with hay. That's a very specific skill set, and it does require a skill level that some people just don't have. And I'll argue with anybody all day long that it is a skilled labor job. But the bottom line is ESD doesn't agree with me. And so, if there's a policy change that I would make right off the bat, I would argue for farm work as skilled labor. And that provides a whole slew of other options that we haven't explored or discussed in any level that I'm aware of. And I think that has some breathing room under the Workforce Modernization Act, or even on a state level, some other, potential opportunity that hasn't come to the fore just yet, but maybe it should.
I would also recommend that if anybody in agriculture is thinking about using salary as an option, to look into the EAP overtime rules. There is a duties test and a whole list of requirements. I do believe some in agriculture would fit in that duties test, but it's complicated. Make sure you're talking with your CPA or your HR director. You're going through the duties test and you make sure that those workers fit within those parameters. So that's something I would suggest that anybody who's interested in that concept, they look that up. Additionally, in 2019, the agriculture associations actually did try to run a budget amendment to remove funding for the yearly survey, really because at this point, with such low survey results that oftentimes don't even meet the 15% threshold, it feels like we are just, throwing money away. We are just flushing it down the toilet at this point. For a survey that results in a tremendous amount of bias, and that bias is incredibly penalizing to farmers. I mean, you're paying these artificially inflated, continually increasing wage rates based on a flawed survey with a terrible statistical threshold. So what are we doing here as a state? Why are we paying for this survey that seems to do nothing but create damages? So there was a little bit of a shot across the bow in 2019, more for anything just to bring some attention to this issue. And that goes back to what I said before, continue to bring this issue up. If you're talking with state and federal politicians, don't let this issue die. Consider, consistently be the squeaky wheel on this issue, because if we can't keep bringing it up, then we can't try to figure out ways to resolve it.
And I do think too, statistical response rate in ag, I'm reaching way back into the cobwebs, but in my graduate education, we never expected a response rate above like 5% for ag community response rate, which is a horrific response rate. You can't get anything that's statistically helpful at that response level. But interestingly enough, here in Washington State at WSU, Professor Don Dillman is the one who perfected survey data collection, particularly in rural and ag communities, and why we're not, kind of looking at that more seriously for issues like this. It concerns me a little bit that we're not more focused on figuring out how to make people like that accessible to the ag community, or anyone else for that matter who needs or is looking for a higher success rate in those survey collections.
Okay, well, I think we're ready for our next slide.
Yeah.
All right, so here's our fourth question. What are the available solutions? And this is what I mentioned at the very beginning. I don't like armchair quarterbacks. I like to find things that all of us can engage in and be successful. Sometimes it looks daunting. Sometimes it looks like we can't have success. But I promise you, when there's an army of people that come together and put everything into making something work, there is success. But it really takes a leap of faith sometimes, and a good group of hardworking folks to get some of these ideas over the finish line. So like I said, this is fourth and final question. So we know that the federal government kind of moves like a herd of turtles, right? So your Farm Workforce Modernization Act probably isn't going to move anytime soon. We know this about the feds. We also know that the state legislature has not been especially ag friendly in recent years. That again has been quite difficult for all of us. And we know there's a fundamental problem with the agriculture surveys. There is something we can work on now, and although it doesn't fix all of agriculture's wage issues, it would provide some immediate relief. House Bill 1750 was just introduced on Monday, and it's what is also commonly referred to as the seasonality bill. Over the last several years, a handful of states have adopted some sort of overtime statute, including Washington. Every one of those states offers some sort of relief for harvest or small growers. Washington is the only state that phases in overtime down to 40 hours per week without any additional form of relief. Last year, agriculture associations attempted to pass a seasonality provision during the overtime battle, but in the end was not successful, unfortunately. House Bill 1750 is prime sponsored by Representative Hoff and co-sponsored by Representative Wallen, which is both a Republican and a Democrat. That's initially quite promising. As you can see on the slide, the concept of seasonality is that it would allow for 12 weeks per year of a farmer's choosing where overtime payments would not begin until after 50 hours per week. I know for many, this is probably only barely scratches the surface of the overtime damages you're facing, but there's value in trying to get some relief, even if it's small. A seasonality provision helps the farmer continue to afford the labor they need, but it is also critical for farm workers. If farmers are forced to cut hours because they can no longer afford labor costs, then the workers will lose those hours that they rely on. As you can see from the graph below, when on-farm hours are averaged throughout the year, it amounts to just around 40 hours per week. The unique thing about agriculture is many of those hours are worked in a really short window of time during harvest. If the new overtime law prevents farm workers from working those extended harvest hours, then their yearly average will dip below an average 40-hour work week. And that worker will no longer have a full-time family wage job at that point. So in order for House Bill 1750 to be successful, we really need farmers and farm workers who are willing to testify about how critical it is to preserve harvest hours for agriculture. So I encourage folks who are listening today to contact the various associations they belong to and develop a plan for supporting this bill. And also, if you're an employer listening to this call, speak to your farm workers about it. Talk about the labor issues you're having, the cost increase issues you're having, and what that could mean to their hours, and help them advocate for themselves by saying, hey, we didn't ask for this and we don't want this. We want our harvest hours. We want them the way they've always been. And when you take that away from them, it hurts my livelihood and my ability to provide for my family. So they're all critical components of this bill that the farmers and farm workers really need to be discussing together, and to the legislators who have the power to fix this issue this year.
So I know Chris has some questions for us, but I do want to jump in really quickly and just highlight. I think, we talk all the time about how farmers are price takers, not price makers. But what that actually means is that we don't set the price for the products that we grow or sell or create on farm. So we have a preset negotiated price, and we can't change that. So anytime we have an additional cost that comes through, we don't get to offset that additional cost by increasing our income somewhere else. We have to figure out how to take it from somewhere. And most farmers, I think, would argue that they don't want to take it from their employees, but we also have to look at figuring out how to survive again on that 10% margin. And that gets really complicated. So if you want to preserve your employees' wages, your trade-off is that maybe you're not buying parts for that tractor that is non-functional, maybe you are not paying for something that you need to help your farm be more efficient or cost effective, or as we see often in Washington, greener or more climate conscious, because you're trying to preserve the welfare of your employee. And it's really important to figure out how we can find a balance to make sure employees have a living wage, but we're also able to do everything else we're asked to do as farmers. And I think I'll hand it over to Chris because I know he's anxiously waiting.
Well, it's such an important issue, both Bre and Pam, and I wonder if you can, we're kind of in a situation in the state, obviously, where a lot of people don't necessarily see farming firsthand. They don't get to participate in farming firsthand. You walk on the streets sometimes and you ask people, where does your milk come? They'll tell you the grocery store, because that's kind of what the thought is. So I wonder if you can kind of put a bow on this and give us like a 20-second elevator speech of what people need to do to spread the message about this particular issue. If they're having coffee with their friend, or they're out to dinner with another couple one night and they're talking about this issue, what's the easiest way to understand it? Because obviously, we like to get into the weeds and talk about the policy, but not everyone understands the policy and the issue really as far as we've taken it. So how do you explain the issue in 10 or 20 seconds?
I think the elevator speech for it is that it comes down to two things. And the first is, we have a farm worker population in Washington state that is vital to our economy. And they contribute a huge amount of both cultural wealth, but also, economic wealth to how we function as a state. The second economic driver in Washington, right here in ag land. And the other part of that is that it really comes down to a food security issue. If we don't have farms in Washington, we have to get our food from somewhere, and it's not here. Right now, Washington state, you can access everything that you need for a healthful and satiating meal in Washington. You don't ever have to buy food from somewhere else. But if we see that continued rate of attrition of 2 farms a week leaving this state or closing down, suddenly you have to get food from somewhere else. And that gets both very expensive and very risky.
Bre, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the most crucial component is getting the consumer to become the advocate here. I mean, everybody eats. It's a nonpartisan issue. It's really an issue that impacts everybody on this planet. Eating isn't a luxury. And I think the consumer we need to provide better education to the consumer so they can be an advocate for agriculture. This is not just reliant on farmers speaking up. We have to have the folks that want these products speaking up as well. And it has been a struggle to get them to advocate on behalf of agriculture. And I don't know what the answer to that is, if it's better public relations, but better PR campaigns, and what it's going to take. I do think we are in a great environment right now. Like Pam was alluding to, with the supply chain problems we're having, items that aren't on the store shelf. We're all going to the grocery store right now, and there's no garlic or there's no squash. I mean, we're all witnessing those empty store shelves. It's the perfect opportunity to start highlighting this conversation. And highlighting the conversation about importing foods from other countries. I mean, do we want China to be the next Apple capital of the world? The legislature thinks they know what ag slavery is. They can go to China and actually figure out what that is. We don't want our food coming from there. We want it coming from Washington. But the consumer, at the end of the day, has to start advocating for these changes.
I have a question from Dominique, who says legislation like this adds certain taxes or overtime requirements or higher wages is exactly why we need a margins-based tax system where all businesses would pay only revenue taxes on your profit margins. The state is never going to stop doing these increases regardless of the fact that we have a surplus of funds available. So we need some method of at least being able to account for all of our overhead costs. Do either of you have thoughts about that?
I think on-farm accounting gets a little bit it's unusual in some ways. In a a CPA will tell you, in a perfect world, farms want their aggregate number at the end of the year to be $0, because you want it to be as minimal as you can make it, theoretically. Generally speaking, like I said, that profit margin is about 10%, and that's where you figure out how you're going to pay for everything. So I think, I sort of like Dominique's idea. I don't know that it fits necessarily best in an ag accounting system.
Sure. And as Jason, our government reform director, points out in the chat, we have proposed replacing the B&O tax with a margins tax. So if you want to read more about that, go to washingtonpolicy.org. From John, can you really say there's an adverse effect from allowing foreign workers to take temporary ag jobs when even at these high rates, no domestic workers apply for these jobs listed through ESD last year?
I think no is the answer. The way that H-2A works, for people who don't know, you have to advertise for 60 days domestically before you can hire a foreign worker. So for 60 days, all farm workers in Washington state have the opportunity to apply for jobs locally. And if no one shows up for that job, or is not qualified for that job, then farmers can say, look, I have no choice but to hire someone from the H-2A system. Maybe they're from South Africa or Guatemala or Jamaica or somewhere else, for that matter. And before I'm going to cut somebody off at the pass, because I know someone's going to ask, H-2A is not free. It's an extraordinarily expensive program. It's cost prohibitive on purpose. What DOL wants you to do is hire a local labor force. It costs an average of $1,500 just to apply to hire one H-2A worker. Now, that doesn't include all of your costs for paying for their housing, their travel, and their wages. So while H-2A is essentially the lifeline for employers in Washington state, it is most certainly a last resort. And despite that, it's a last resort that results in an average of 25,000 employees in Washington state.
Well, John, I appreciate your question. Does that adverse effects situation still exist? And I think you bring up a really great point, and something that, to be honest, I don't think I've ever had a conversation around. But you're right. And then that's the fundamental issue, right? That's why the AWAR was created, so that you weren't disproportionately impacting the domestic workers' ability to get high wages and available jobs. Now we have a situation where we have the second highest wages in the nation, tied with Oregon, and we have 25,000 available jobs. So we have jobs and we have high wages. Are you still depressing the domestic workforce at this point? Well, the answer looks like no. And if that's the case, what's the point of the AWAR at this point? Is if the situation no longer exists where there is this adverse effect because of the program. So I think you bring up a really good point, and one that I think the conversation has to start revolving around. And like I said, I've never once even had that conversation, and I think it's really intriguing.
Another question here from Howard, and depending on how long it takes to answer this question, it may be our last, but we'll see if we can get a couple more. Howard says, when do you expect this bill to come forward so we can be prepared to testify?
So the bill dropped on Monday. So let's see, what's today, Wednesday? So it's only been out a couple of days. There are Republicans and Democrats that have signed on to the bill. And so now, if you were interested in helping moving this House Bill 1750 along, which is seasonality, I would suggest that you reach out to your local legislator and ask for this bill to get a hearing. It's going to take public pressure to convince the majority party that this bill should get scheduled in the House Labor Committee. So please help us out by putting some pressure on that situation. And then as soon as a hearing date comes out, we can absolutely share that with everyone so that you know the date and time and about how long you have to talk. And hopefully we can bring light to this situation on a broader scale.
Amy asks, are you finding any correlation with the regulatory schemes that make farming fiscally unsustainable and the special interest groups that believe farming is an obstacle to reducing greenhouse gases?
I don't know that there's a correlation necessarily. I think that what we are seeing is that because people don't necessarily understand how farming operates and that it is in a farmer's best interest to be as conscious as they can of their environment already, there's just an operational misunderstanding of how farming operates. It benefits a farmer to take care of the soil, to take care of their water, to do all the things that would be considered green already. And so I don't know that there's a correlation, but I do think that when you see bills come forward that are meant to be about sustainability and they seemingly are punitive as they relate to ag, it's because legislators don't understand that farmers do a lot of these things already, and piling on top of what farmers already do simply adds to their cost and workload and sort of de facto forces them out of business.
Any final thoughts about that, Bre, before we wrap things up?
No, I feel like Pam covered that.
Well, again, thank you very much to Bre Elsey and Pam Lewison, our ag director. This is another one of those important topics. Seems like we've got a theme going here this morning that we really want to make sure that we're tackling. So go to WashingtonPolicy.org, click on the Agriculture Research Center. You can find out more about this issue, about a whole host of other issues. And as we mentioned, we have a resource page on the front page of WashingtonPolicy.org right now to give you up-to-date information from all of our different sessions throughout the day. The Solution Summit will continue here in just a moment. We're going to have a conversation about 5 minutes about social media, censorship, and censoring free market ideas and free market thought. And then don't forget our keynote session coming up at noon with Brandy Cruz, the reporter and the face behind the Undivided podcast and some of the things that you're seeing online called Undivided. So Brandy Cruz, great opportunity to hear from her at noon. So thanks for joining us for the Solution Summit. Again, thanks to Pam and Bre, and we'll be back here in just a few moments.